The MinisForum HX99G is a gaming mini PC that actually does exactly what it says on the case. It plays games and plays them extremely well. But before we get onto the fun stuff, a quick reminder to subscribe if you have not already. We are very close to 10,000 subscribers and they won't let me leave the office and go home until we reach the target. A very brief unboxing for the HX99G. First out of the box is a user guide which is in multiple languages including Chinese, English, German, Spanish and Italian. Up next we have the HX99G gaming mini PC, which we will take a closer look at shortly. Underneath the packaging is the power brick and lead. We will include the correct adapter for your country. There is a pack containing the heatsinks and thermal pads for when installing your RAM. As a note, if you do buy from us pre-configured, then we will use these when installing the RAM. And next we have the HDMI cable which connects the HX99G to your monitor or TV. And last but not least, there is a stand with a bracket and screws which you can use to stand the HX99G vertically. The MinisForum HX99G measures around 8.07 by 7.99 by 2.72 inches and weighs 1.4 kilos. On the front there is a USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A port followed by a dedicated 3.5mm headphone and microphone jacks. Beside that is a USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type C port and the power button. On the back there is a 4-pin power supply port. There are 2 USB 4 Type C ports and just below are 2 HDMI ports. You can use them together for quad monitor display, 2 at 8K 60Hz and 2 at 4K 60Hz respectively. Next we have 3 USB 3.2 ports, 2 are Gen 1 and the other is Gen 2. And again, last but not least, there is a 2.5GB Ethernet port. We are trying the HX99G with a new 4K portable touchscreen monitor and gamepad that we will be selling. Check the links in the description if you want to learn more and keep an eye out for their review shortly. The MinisForum HX99G runs on the AMD Ryzen 6900HX processor, which has 8 cores and 16 threads running up to 4.9 GHz at 45 watts TDP. It does have an integrated 680M GPU, but we won't be using that. It comes with the AMD Radeon RX6600M mobile graphics card, which is far more powerful. It supports up to 64 gigs of DDR5 RAM and up to 2TB of PCIe 4 SSD. For communications, we have the Ethernet port for wired data and Wi-Fi 6 as well as Bluetooth 5.2 for wireless. Whilst running the Cinebench benchmark, we ran a few tests. We got a peak power draw of 199 watts, highest fan noise of 55 decibels, and highest temperature of 56 degrees Celsius. As always, we run a few system benchmarks covering CPU, GPU, RAM and storage speed, as well as different usages such as general software, gaming and video editing. This gives us some data which we can use to see the overall performance and also compare to other gaming mini PCs. First, we have the PassMark benchmark results. The HX99G takes a very respectable second place, beating the NUC Xi5 in third and behind the NUC Xi7 in first. The NUC Xi7 CPU and 3070 laptop GPU definitely give it the lead, but the HX99G does have a great jump on the Intel i5 model, which has the laptop 3060 GPU. Next, we have the PC Mark 10 benchmark results. This is more of your day-to-day tests ranging from web browsing through to image and video editing. The HX99G takes first place here with a decent gap of around 7% between the UM690 in second place. Onto the Cinebench multi-core test. This tests the CPU and we can see that the MinisForum UM690 and HX99G have almost identical scores. After all, they do have the same Ryzen 9 6900HX processor. There is quite a gap between second and third place with the GTR6 taking it. The two NUC X models fall quite far behind on this test. Our final system benchmark is 3D Mark. We test Firestrike, Night Raid and Time Spy. For Firestrike, we can see that the HX99G in second place behind the NUC Xi7 and again on the Night Raid benchmark. It drops down to third place behind the NUC Xi5 for the Time Spy test, but only by a small margin. We are now testing some games across 720p, 1080p and 4K resolutions to see how well the HX99G does with different games and resolutions. Starting with Forza Horizon 5, we can see that at 4K the HX99G does well in second place. It gets 94 frames per second compared with 101 on the Nook Xi7. At 1080p is where there is a power shift with the HX99G. It has a massive 198 frames per second average compared to just 153 on the Nook Xi7 in second place. And at 720p we can see a minor increase at 200 frames per second, but still far ahead of the Nook Xi7. We won't see such a dramatic gap in other benchmarks, but it goes to show what optimising can do for a game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is optimised more for Intel and Nvidia based devices, so we can see if there is much difference. At 4K we can see the HX99G in third place, with the Nook Xi5 and i7 taking the lead. But at 1080p we can again see a switch, with the HX99G taking first place just ahead of the Nook Xi7. The pattern repeats at 720p. Onto Cyberpunk 2077 next, which is a highly demanding game and a great test of performance. We can see again that at 4K resolution the HX99G is in third place, and at 1080p the HX99G jumps up to second, with the Nook Xi7 still in front. But at 720p the HX99G takes a massive leap ahead of the Nook Xi7. Very impressive and a great frame rate if you play at 720p. Our final benchmark is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The MinisForum HX99G is essentially tied with the Nook Xi5 for second place. Again, the pattern continues once we go to 1080p, which is a jump in performance for the HX99G, taking a solid second place. And at 720p we can see that while the HX99G remains in second place, there is only a few frames per second difference between it and the Nook Xi7. The benchmark results are interesting. At 4K the Nook Xi5 and i7 models do very well, but if we drop down to 1080 or 720p we can see that the HX99G performs far more competitively against the 30 series GPUs. If 1080p gaming is what you're looking for, then the HX99G is definitely the one to consider. Running benchmarks over and over is all well and good, but what about games at playable settings? We will take a brief look at a few AAA games and see how far we can push the settings before we get performance issues that affect playing. For Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 we can run at 4K resolution with no upscaling on the minimal graphic settings. We get around 64 FPS and this will drop below 60 on busier scenes. At 1440p balanced graphics we get around 85 FPS, which should be fine. You may get rare drops below 60, so lowering to minimal settings gives you an extra 10 frames per second. At 1080p on the extreme graphics settings with no upscaling we get around 120 FPS average, which is plenty. You can increase the anti-aliasing to ultra and lose 20 or so frames to make it look even nicer. Hogwarts Legacy at 4K medium graphics with no upscaling was getting us around 30 FPS, and on low graphics around 35. It was a bit too low for smooth gameplay. At 1440p low graphics settings we saw a nice jump to around 60 FPS. You will see some dips below 60, so you can leave it at that or lock the frame rate to 30. At 1080p we can go up to the ultra graphics settings and get around 58 FPS. Lock it to 30 if you wanted to, or drop down to the high graphics mix settings and we get a solid 60 FPS. You can mostly play Resident Evil 4 Remake at 4K on the prioritised performance settings at 60 FPS with some minor drops now and again. Or you can run it at 1440p on the balanced graphics settings locked to 30 FPS. And if you lower to prioritised performance settings then you will get 60. At 1080p on the prioritised graphics settings we get mostly 60 frames per second with some occasional dips below that. Lowering to balanced graphics will get you a stable 60. Wolong does suffer from some pretty bad performance issues across different PCs, including desktops, handhelds and mini PCs. At 4K and 1440p the game was unplayable. At 1080p standard graphics settings we get around 40 frames per second with dips at random intervals. Lowering to 720p on the standard graphics settings got us 60 FPS, but we still got some random dips in performance. So we locked the frame rate to 30 in hopes that it would fix it, but again still random dips. It's just a poorly optimised game and hopefully it does get fixed someday. As you will probably guess, that MinisForum HX99G will run just about every emulator up to the more recent ones with no issues at all. With most, you will be able to upscale graphics and use other mods to improve the visuals. So let's take a look at some of the more higher demanding emulators. We start off with the Xbox 360. Our go-to game Vanquish runs at a solid frame rate whilst at 1080p resolution and below. We also tried Project Gotham Racing 3 and were burning rubber at full frame rates. Running at 4K resolution will have mixed results with performance, so I recommend keeping it at 1080p. We had no major issues with the PlayStation 3 emulator RPCS3. Our go-to games Tekken 6 and Wipeout HD run at full 60 FPS. You may see some rare minor drops when shader caching at the starter levels, but nothing that affects the gameplay on compatible games. For the most part, we were getting full speed on many of the games we tried on RYUJINX and YUZU. Both first and third party games run great. You may see some drops below full frame rate now and again, but nothing that spoils playing the games. Straight off the bat, I have to say this is a very impressive gaming mini PC. While it is a little larger than your usual mini PC, it's nowhere near the size of the larger NUC models, which are its main competitors. A gaming mini PC should have a small form factor, and the HX99G fits into this category just fine. We like that the gaming mini PC can be used with and without the vertical stand at your preference. And even while pushing the mini PC to its limits, the fan noise was fairly quiet. If you do have game audio or some noise in the background, you will barely hear it. We also like that it is portable. You can fit it into a small bag or rucksack, and combined with a portable monitor and gamepad, you can game just about anywhere there is a power supply. For 1440p and 4K gaming, the HX99G does a respectable job. However, if you plan to game at these resolutions, then the NUC i7 is definitely what you should be considering. Based on the price, the HX99G is a fair bit cheaper, and at 1080p and below, it often beats or comes fairly close to beating the NUC i7. Don't forget that 1080p is still the most popular screen resolution for gaming. If you plan to game at 1080p or even 720p, then the HX99G is the perfect choice. You can learn more about the MinisForum HX99G and order yours today at DroiX.co.uk or DroiX.net for worldwide shipping. Use the code HX99G5OFF on the checkout for 5% off. Please note that the code is not valid during sales or promotions and may expire after 1 month. We hope you have found our review useful. If you did, why not subscribe, and you can keep up to date with our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you in our next one.